It felt like we had finally reached a point where we could exhale, maybe even believe the chaos was settling down. But then this hit, and once again, gun owners across the nation are left scratching their heads, asking not just what happened, but why it played out the way it did. It feels like déjà vu every single time. Just when progress looks possible, the floor drops out. And this time, it is not the usual enemies of gun rights. This time, the letdown comes from people many in our community thought they could rely on. So here is the situation. Only a few days back, the Department of Justice signed off on an internal deal that basically stops the enforcement of the old classification on certain firearm parts pieces that have been in legal limbo for years. The ATF had been grabbing them left and right, calling them federally banned. We are talking about things like force reset triggers, which were automatically labeled as machine guns, even though anyone with a working knowledge of firearms knows they do not function that way. Now the DOJ has flipped its stance. Sounds like a step forward, right? That was my first thought too. But then I dug into the details, and it hit me we are getting strung along again. Headlines will say this is a Second Amendment victory, that gun owners are having stolen property returned, that the government is correcting past abuse. But those of us who have been around the block know better. Nothing in this game is ever that simple. Sure, some folks will see their gear come back, but if you live in one of the 16 states that immediately sued over this settlement, you are out of luck. Residents there are being told flat out, no returns. The ATF is now sending letters offering only two options: have the parts destroyed or ship them to someone else in another state. That is it. No middle ground. To me, that is not a win. That is selective justice. That is a two-tiered system where federal law only applies if your state's politicians allow it. That is not how America is supposed to work. The federal government is supposed to set the standard. States can tack on extra restrictions if they choose, but they cannot cancel out what Washington already deemed legal. At least that used to be the understanding. But when it comes to firearms lately, it seems the feds are perfectly fine letting the states dictate the rules. And that is what stings the most. This was supposed to be the turning point after years of raids, confiscations, lawsuits, and uncertainty. Finally, a unified ruling. Companies that had been dragged through the dirt could restart business. Gun owners who had been treated like criminals could finally clear their names. But instead, what do we get? A carve-out deal that hands anti-gun states exactly what they wanted: the power to ignore a federal decision and continue treating lawful citizens like felons. What makes it worse is how it happened. This was not the Supreme Court issuing a final ruling. It was not even a long, hard-fought trial. This was voluntary, a settlement, something that could have been written to protect everyone equally, but it wasn't. And that alone tells you where the real priorities are. Because if the aim was truly to restore faith in the Second Amendment, this isn't how you do it. You don't abandon millions of lawful gun owners just because they live in the wrong state. You stand up for the Constitution across the board. And what really makes me uneasy is how quietly this went down. One moment, the ATF is pounding on doors, sending threat letters, insisting these devices will land you in prison. The next moment, the enforcement stops cold, no press conference, no real explanation, just a quiet policy reversal followed by a settlement. And funny enough, 16 states were already lined up with lawsuits the moment it was announced. And they walked away with exactly what they wanted. Not because a judge said they were right, but because the DOJ chose not to fight them. You know what comes next. That carve-out will become a model. Next time there's a pro-gun ruling, more states will demand their own exception. they'll say their circumstances are different and their local laws should outweigh federal decisions. And if this administration won't push back now, why would they later? It sets a dangerous precedent. It signals to anti-gun states that yelling loud enough will let them keep doing whatever they want, even if it contradicts federal law. And let's be honest here, it was never really about the devices. Most shooters aren't running around with forced reset triggers on their rifles. A lot of folks hadn't even heard of them until the ATF made it a headline issue. What matters is the principle. If the federal government says something is legal, you shouldn't have to check your zip code to figure out whether you're a criminal for owning it. You shouldn't be punished just because your state's attorney general wants to make a political point. Yet, here we are. Now, some will argue this was just legal strategy, that maybe the administration figured compromise was quicker than dragging things through the courts. Maybe they wanted fewer lawsuits, less political drama. I get that. But at what cost? Every time we let politics twist the Constitution, we move further from equal protection under the law. Once exceptions start, there's no stopping point. Today, it is forced reset triggers. Tomorrow, maybe it is pistol braces, bump stocks, or magazine limits. When enforcement isn't consistent, everything starts blending together, and rights end up eroded piece by piece. What unsettles me most is this: rights only matter if they're consistent. If the standards keep changing, depending on which party controls Washington or which state line you cross, then it isn't really a right anymore. It turns into a privilege, something you've got to apply for, ask permission for, and hope you don't lose tomorrow. That's never what the Second Amendment was meant to be. It wasn't advice. It wasn't a suggestion for certain regions. It was a promise of protection for every American, no matter where they live. And let's be honest, seeing this play out in July makes it sting even worse. We just finished celebrating Independence Day, a holiday built around the idea of liberty and sacrifice. Yet here we are, watching freedom carved up by geography. You can stand tall with your rights in Texas, but not in Illinois. You might get your seized firearms returned in Florida, but you're out of luck in Oregon. That's not liberty, it's selective freedom. And anyone who cares about equal rights should be furious at that. What really burns is the issue of trust. Gun owners were beginning to think maybe this administration was finally going to back them. And just when that belief started to take hold, we get slapped in the face. Maybe it's not betrayal in the purest sense. Maybe it's just politics, steamrolling principle, but the effect is the same. People who played by the book, who obeyed the law, who filled out every form they were told to fill out, are now punished for having the wrong state on their driver's license. Their rights vanish because of a zip code. That's a bitter pill, because this isn't some classroom debate about theory. These are real Americans with real rifles, real property, taken by force under a legal ruling that has since been tossed aside. Instead of setting it right across the board, instead of saying we screwed up, here's your gear back, the powers that be decided to draw lines on a map. These guys get their justice. The rest of you? Tough luck, your state sued us, and we don't want the headache. So where does that leave us? Right where we've always been fighting the same battle under new names. Because in truth, none of these fights are about safety, legality, or whether a stabilizing brace is a piece of plastic or a stock. They're about control. They're about whether the government will allow its citizens to manage their rights responsibly, and who gets to decide when those rights are valid. And here's the kicker. Even though it was dressed up as a compromise, even though they tried to sell it as a fair middle ground, what it really amounts to is surrender. When you agree to give back only part of what was never theirs to take, when you start dividing Americans into groups based on lawsuits and politics, you didn't win, you just bought time until the next attack. And make no mistake, another fight is coming, because now we've set a precedent. If a state files a complaint, they can opt out of federal protection. That loophole will be used again. And the lawyers crafting these moves, they know exactly what they're doing. They'll carve away at rights one exception at a time. Before long, that solid wall of liberty turns into Swiss cheese holes, contradictions, exceptions, until the whole thing falls apart. That's why I can't celebrate this so-called win. I'm not clapping for the DOJ. I'm not patting anyone on the back for doing the bare minimum. A real victory for the Second Amendment would cover every single gun owner, not just those lucky enough to live in the right states. A real win would admit the original ruling was wrong and fix the damage everywhere, not just where it's politically convenient. And sure, I know the talking point. At least it's something. At least it's progress. But that only makes sense if you believe the government has the right to snatch your freedoms in the first place. And you should feel grateful when they hand part of them back. I don't buy that. Rights aren't gifts, they're guarantees. They're not chips on a bargaining table. The moment we treat them that way, we've already lost the moral high ground to defend them. That's why this conversation matters. Even if people are tired of hearing about lawsuits, ATF memos, or brace bans. Because it's bigger than that. It's about getting Americans used to the idea that rights are conditional, that they vary by state line, by political cycle, by who's sitting in the Oval Office. And if we let that mindset take root, one morning we'll wake up and barely recognize our country. Not because of one law, but because of a long series of tiny compromises, each one wrapped in words like reasonable, responsible, and necessary. That's how liberty dies, not in an explosion, but in a slow erosion camouflaged as balance. So, no, I'm not mad that some folks are finally getting their rifles, their .308 Remingtons, their .22 long rifles back. I'm glad for them. But I'm also furious that others are left empty-handed, not because of anything they did, but because of where they live. And if that becomes the norm, what's stopping the next administration from doing it all over again to a different group in a different place? We still have time to fix it, but it's going to take more than internet rants and YouTube videos. It's going to take accountability. It's going to take refusing to let carve-outs and half measures become the standard. Because once trust is gone, it's nearly impossible to rebuild, and a lot of shooters right now feel completely abandoned. Not just by the agencies, but by leaders who swore they'd defend our rights, only to cave the second the heat got turned up. That betrayal sticks. So here we are, yet again, in the never-ending fight for rights that should have been settled generations ago. Another lesson that freedom isn't permanent, and every inch gained can be clawed back if we're not vigilant. But if there's one takeaway, it's this. Silence only helps the people trying to erode liberty. The more we speak, the more we shine a light, the harder it is for anyone to pretend this is acceptable. And that's what I hope this message does remind you, that you're not standing alone. Your anger, your distrust, your disappointment, they're valid. And this fight isn't over. Not now, not ever. As long as we refuse to settle for second-class rights, there's hope. Thanks for sticking with me. We'll talk again soon.